A widowed teacher covers for her student's absence, unaware he's secretly working to save his farm. The words haunted Eleanor Mitchell as she stood before her empty classroom, the first rays of morning light casting long shadows across 29 desks. 29, not 30. For the third time this week, Noah Bennett's seat remained vacant, a hollow reminder of promises unfulfilled. Eleanor's red pen hovered over the attendance sheet, her hand trembling slightly. She should mark him absent. School policy demanded it. 3 unexcused absences triggered the system. Calls home, disciplinary action, the whole bureaucratic machine designed to keep students accountable. But something in her hesitated, the pen suspended in midair like a conductor's baton frozen before the downbeat. Maybe it was the memory of Noah's eyes, intelligent, determined, but lately shadowed with something she recognized too well: exhaustion, worry. The weight of carrying something too heavy alone. With a small sigh that seemed to echo in the empty room, Eleanor lowered her pen and marked him present. The small act of defiance against the rules felt both terrifying and necessary, like the first step onto thin ice. She'd cover for him, just this once. The silver wedding band still encircling her finger caught the light as she closed the attendance book. 3 years a widow, and Daniel's absence still felt like a phantom limb, present in its very absence. Some mornings she woke reaching for warmth that wasn't there anymore. Some nights she caught herself saving stories to tell someone who would never hear them. Mrs. Mitchell? The voice startled her from her reverie. She looked up to find Principal Garcia standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable behind thick-rimmed glasses. The bell rang 2 minutes ago. Your sophomores are waiting in the hallway. Eleanor nodded, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. Of course. I was just preparing. As students filed in, bringing with them the controlled chaos of teenage energy, Eleanor's gaze returned briefly to the empty desk by the window. What kept pulling a straight-A student away from his education? Noah Bennett had always been the first to arrive, last to leave, the kind of student teachers dream about: curious, hardworking, respectful. Until 3 weeks ago when the absences began. At first just Mondays, then Mondays and Fridays, now increasingly random days that followed no pattern she could discern. The question nagged at her through 3 periods of American literature, through discussions of Fitzgerald and Hemingway, through lunch duty and faculty meetings. By afternoon, when she drove her aging Honda past acres of struggling farmland on her way home, the question had become a decision. Tomorrow, she would find out what was happening to Noah Bennett. Dawn broke over Oak Ridge in shades of muted gold, painting the weathered barn in gentle light that belied its precarious state. Noah Bennett had been awake for hours already, his hands raw from milking cows in the pre-dawn darkness. At 17, his shoulders carried the burden of a man 3 times his age. The ancient tractor sputtered to life beneath him, the familiar rattle of its engine both comforting and concerning. How much longer before that, too, would fail them? His father's medical bills from the accident covered their kitchen table like fallen leaves, unavoidable, accumulating, suffocating what little hope remained. "You're going to be late," his father called from the porch, leaning heavily on his crutches. Jack Bennett's voice carried across the yard, strong despite the broken body that housed it. 6 months since the tractor accident had crushed his legs, and still the doctors weren't sure if he'd ever walk normally again. Noah wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. "I'm not going today." "The hell you're not?" His father's face darkened like gathering storm clouds. "We agreed. Your education comes first. The south pasture fence needs fixing before we lose more cattle." Harris called. "He needs help with his haying if we want that extra income." "And the bank? Damn the bank!" Jack's voice cracked with emotion he rarely displayed. "And damn my useless legs. But you're not missing more school, Noah." "I won't have it." The ensuing silence held the weight of all they didn't say: the foreclosure notice that had arrived yesterday, the dwindling savings, the impossibility of their situation. A father who couldn't run his farm, a son too young to shoulder it all but trying anyway. 2 more hours, Noah negotiated. "I'll fix the fence and go in late." Jack's face softened, the lines of worry temporarily easing. "Your mother would have my hide if she knew what I was letting you do." The mention of his mother, 4 years gone to cancer, hung between them, both comfort and wound. Noah nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. 2 hours turned to 3, then 4. By the time Noah had repaired the fence, helped the neighbor load hay, and cleaned up enough to be presentable, the school day was more than half over. There was no point in going now. Another absence to add to his growing collection. Another day falling behind in classes he once excelled in. Another day closer to losing everything. Eleanor's red Toyota pulled into the long, rutted driveway of Bennett Farm just as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the fields. She'd debated this decision all day, whether it constituted crossing a professional boundary, whether Noah would resent the intrusion, but concern had ultimately outweighed hesitation. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with uncertainty. She hadn't made a home visit in all her 15 years of teaching, but then she'd never covered for a student's unexplained absences before either. The farmhouse stood weathered but proud against the backdrop of rolling hills and oak trees. Once white paint peeled from its exterior, revealing gray wood beneath, like scars on skin that had endured too much. A porch wrapped around the front, where wind chimes tinkled a melancholy tune in the autumn breeze. As Eleanor stepped from her car, the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes sounded unnaturally loud in the country quiet. She was halfway to the porch when movement near the barn caught her eye. Noah stood frozen in the barn doorway, shock evident on his face even from a distance. In his arms, he cradled what appeared to be a newborn calf, its wet coat glistening in the slanting sunlight. "Mrs. Mitchell?" His voice carried across the yard, equal parts confusion and alarm. Eleanor felt suddenly, intensely foolish, an intruder in a world she didn't understand. The textbooks and lesson plans that defined her authority seemed meaningless here, where life and death played out in barns and fields, where her student clearly battled challenges she'd never imagined. I was concerned, she called, remaining where she stood, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. "You've missed several classes." Noah glanced down at the calf in his arms, then back at his teacher. Conflict played across his features. Embarrassment, pride, worry. Finally, he nodded toward the barn. "I need to get this little one settled." Her mother rejected her. "You can come in if you want." The invitation, reluctant though it was, gave Eleanor permission to cross the invisible boundary. She followed him into the shadowed interior of the barn, where the sweet smell of hay mingled with the earthier scents of animals and work. Inside, Noah gently placed the calf on a bed of straw, his movements betraying both expertise and tenderness. "She needs colostrum in the first hours or she won't make it," he explained, reaching for a bottle of yellowish liquid. "Dad would help, but his legs—" "Your father is injured?" Eleanor asked softly, piecing together the puzzle of Noah's absences. Noah nodded, not looking up as he coaxed the tiny calf to take the bottle. "Farm accident. 6 months ago. He can't do much yet, and we can't afford help." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, hit Eleanor with unexpected force. She thought of the essays Noah had turned in, brilliant analyses of literary themes, insights beyond his years, and tried to reconcile them with this young man kneeling in straw, fighting to save both a newborn calf and his family's livelihood. "So you've been running the farm?" she asked, though the answer was evident in the exhaustion lining his young face, the calluses on his hands as he held the bottle. "Trying to—" At last he met her eyes. "I know school is important. My dad reminds me every day. But if we lose the farm?" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. Eleanor knelt beside him, her teacher's skirt gathering dust from the barn floor. "Why didn't you tell someone? The school has programs, resources. We don't take handouts." The words came automatically, rehearsed, a family motto, then softer. "And it wouldn't be enough anyway. The bank's given us till the end of the year to get current on payments." The calf sucked greedily at the bottle, tiny tail flicking with the effort of living. Eleanor watched in silence, the enormity of Noah's situation settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. How many other struggles remained invisible behind her students' faces? How many battles did they fight alone while she droned on about symbolism in The Great Gatsby? "You're quite good at that," she said, nodding toward his capable hands as they tended the calf. Something like pride flickered across his face. "My grandmother taught me. She said bringing life into the world is the most important work there is." The words resonated in the dusty barn air. Eleanor thought of her own empty house, the silent rooms where children's voices should have been, would have been, if fate and biology had been kinder. The life she and Daniel had planned, now forever unrealized. "Your grandmother was wise," she managed. When the feeding was complete, Noah showed her around the barn, introducing the milk cows by name, explaining the challenges of the coming winter, the financial tightrope they walked. He spoke with the knowledge of someone 3 times his age, occasional flashes of boyish enthusiasm breaking through when he described his dreams for modern equipment, sustainable practices, a farm that could support generations to come. By the time they emerged into the fading daylight, something had shifted between them. No longer merely teacher and student, but 2 people standing on common ground, seeing each other clearly perhaps for the first time. "I've been marking you present," Eleanor admitted as they walked toward the house. "I shouldn't have, but thank you." Noah's voice was quiet but intense. "One more problem with the school would be, I just can't right now." At the porch steps, Jack Bennett appeared, leaning on his crutches, his weathered face a map of pride and worry as he looked between his son and the unexpected visitor. "Dad, this is Mrs. Mitchell, my literature teacher." Jack's eyes, so like his son's, widened slightly. "Well now, we don't get many visitors from town these days." Despite obvious pain, he straightened. "Can I offer you some coffee, Mrs. Mitchell? It might be the only thing in this house that isn't in short supply." The hospitality, offered from a place of such scarcity, brought an unexpected lump to Eleanor's throat. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Bennett." Over mugs of strong coffee at a kitchen table worn smooth by generations of elbows, Eleanor began to understand. The accident that had almost claimed Jack's life, the mounting medical bills, the impossible choice between seeking proper medical care and keeping the 5th-generation farm, the wall calendar marked with bank deadlines and auction dates. The textbooks stacked neatly in the corner, evidence of Noah's determination to keep up despite everything. "He's brilliant, you know," she told Jack, watching Noah's ears redden as he pretended to be absorbed in washing dishes. "One of the finest minds I've encountered in my teaching career." "Gets that from his mother," Jack said, a shadow of grief passing over his features. "She always had her nose in a book. Wanted him to be the first Bennett to go to college." "I'm still going," Noah interjected, turning from the sink. "Once we get through this rough patch." "If," Jack corrected gently. "If we get through, son." The word hung in the kitchen like frost, crystallizing the reality Eleanor had been slowly absorbing. This wasn't just about missed classes. It was about a family legacy teetering on extinction, a boy's future narrowing with each passing day. As she prepared to leave, the setting sun casting long shadows across the struggling farm, Eleanor made a decision that seemed to rise from some deep, long-dormant place within her heart. "Noah," she said, standing by her car, "I'd like to help you catch up on your schoolwork. We could meet during lunch periods or after school on days when the farm allows." The offer wasn't enough, she knew that. A few literature lessons wouldn't save a failing farm. But it was what she had to give, a first step onto uncertain ground. Noah studied her face, wariness and hope battling in his expression. Why would you do that? Eleanor thought of Daniel, of empty rooms and shattered dreams, of the purpose she'd been seeking since losing him. "Because teaching isn't just about what happens in classrooms," she said simply. "It's about seeing what students need to learn, even when that isn't on any curriculum." As she drove away, watching the farmhouse recede in her rearview mirror, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the quiet stirring of purpose, like a buried seed finally reaching toward light. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm neither had anticipated. Mondays and Thursdays, Eleanor arrived at the farm after school, books tucked under her arm, determination in her step. Sometimes they worked at the kitchen table, Noah's tired eyes struggling to focus on Steinbeck and Shakespeare after hours of physical labor. Other days, when farm emergencies couldn't wait, she read aloud while he repaired equipment or tended animals, her voice carrying over the sounds of work. On days when Noah made it to school, she saved him a sandwich from the faculty lounge, slipping it to him without comment when his own lunch was noticeably absent. Small gestures, inadequate against the magnitude of the Bennett's problems, yet offering what sustenance she could. "You never told me why you really decided to help," Noah said one afternoon in late October as they walked the property line, golden leaves crunching beneath their feet. Eleanor had insisted on the break, noticing how his eyes had grown unfocused after an hour of essay writing. She considered deflecting, giving the teacher's answer about potential and academic responsibility. Instead, she found herself speaking truth. "My husband died 3 years ago," she said, the words feeling strange in the open air after being held so tightly inside. "Car accident." One moment building our future, the next? She shook her head. We'd been trying to have children. When he died, I lost not just him, but the family we'd planned. Noah listened silently, his young face solemn with a compassion beyond his years. After that, teaching became mechanical, something I did without truly being present. She brushed a leaf from her sleeve. Then you started missing class, and I saw something in you that reminded me of myself after Daniel died. Someone drowning but refusing to call for help. They walked in silence for several paces before Noah spoke. Mom died 4 years ago. Cancer. His voice was steady, but she caught the slight tightening of his jaw. Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like. The simple confession, shared without expectation of response, cemented something between them, a recognition of parallel grief, of understanding that needed no elaborate expression. What was she like? Eleanor asked. Noah's smile transformed his face, erasing momentarily the weight of adult worries. She loved thunderstorms, would drag chairs onto the porch and make us watch them roll in. Dad would pretend to grumble, but he'd always sit with us. She said big things like storms and stars put human problems in perspective. As if conjured by the memory, distant thunder rumbled over the hillside. They both looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. We should head back, Noah said, practical concerns immediately reasserting themselves. I need to get the new calves into the barn before that hits. They quickened their pace, the impending storm creating a sudden urgency. By the time they reached the barn, the wind had picked up, bending the tall grasses in rippling waves. Noah worked efficiently, directing Eleanor to help herd the youngest calves to shelter, while he secured equipment and closed gates. The storm hit just as they finished, rain lashing against the barn in sheets. They stood in the doorway, watching the deluge transform the farmyard into a maze of puddles. Thank you, Noah said, his voice nearly lost beneath the drumming of rain on the roof. For helping, for listening, for treating me like the remarkable young man you are, Eleanor supplied when he trailed off. He shook his head, embarrassed. I was going to say like a person, not just a problem. The simple statement caught her off guard with its unintended mirror to her own experience. How after Daniel's death, she'd felt reduced to her tragedy, a walking reminder of loss rather than a whole person still living. Lightning flashed, illuminating the barn in stark white light before plunging them back into dimness. In that brief illumination, Eleanor saw not just the boy she'd been tutoring, but the man emerging through hardship, stronger at the broken places, like a bone that heals more solid after fracture. The remarkable thing, she said after a moment, is that despite everything, you haven't given up. On the farm, on school, on your future, that kind of resilience can't be taught in classrooms. Noah looked out at the rain, his profile thoughtful. Sometimes I want to, though. Give up. When the numbers don't add up no matter how I calculate them. When Dad's in too much pain to sleep but won't take stronger medication because it costs too much. The quiet admission hung between them, honest in a way that only shared struggle permits. I know, Eleanor said simply. I still have days when getting out of bed feels impossible, when the emptiness seems too vast to navigate. What makes you do it anyway? The question, direct, genuine, deserved an equally honest answer. Some days just stubborn defiance. Other days the students who need something I can give them. She smiled gently. Recently a certain farm with a calf that needed feeding. That earned a small smile from Noah, quickly replaced by seriousness as thunder crashed directly overhead, making the barn walls shudder. He's not going to make it, is he? Noah asked, his voice suddenly younger, vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed. My dad. The doctors say he needs another surgery, specialized physical therapy. Even if we had the money, the recovery would take months. Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to offer false reassurance, but equally unwilling to confirm his fears. Your father is one of the strongest people I've met, Noah. But no one should have to choose between healing and home. The rain intensified, drumming a chaotic rhythm above them. Noah's shoulders slumped slightly, the perpetual tension he carried momentarily giving way to the weight he'd been bearing. Without thinking, Eleanor reached out, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, the kind of maternal gesture she'd offered countless students over the years, but which now carried new meaning. Not just teacher to student, but human to human, sharing the burden of impossible choices. We'll figure something out, she said, the we slipping out naturally, commitment forming before conscious decision. There has to be a way. Noah looked at her hand on his shoulder, then met her eyes with a gaze too old for 17. Why do you care so much? About us, about the farm? You barely knew me 6 weeks ago. The question deserved honesty. Eleanor dropped her hand, taking a deep breath that smelled of rain and earth and possibility. Because helping you gives me purpose again, she admitted. Because in your determination, I see echoes of the son Daniel and I might have had. Because this farm isn't just buildings and land, it's your heritage, your future. She paused. And because sometimes, Noah, people just need to matter to someone else. The rain began to ease, the downpour softening to a gentle patter. Light broke through the clouds to the west, sending shafts of gold across the sodden fields. You matter to me, Noah said finally, the words simple but profound in their honesty. You and this farm are the only things that make sense anymore. They stood in silence, watching as the storm clouds rolled eastward, leaving behind a world washed clean. In its wake, a rainbow arched across the sky, improbably bright against the retreating darkness. Mom would have loved this, Noah said softly. Daniel too, Eleanor agreed. Side by side, they watched nature's promise stretch across the horizon, a bridge between storm and calm, past and future, loss and hope. November arrived with bitter winds and the first dusting of snow, matching the chill of dread that had settled in the Bennett household. The bank's deadline loomed just 6 weeks away, the amount needed to prevent foreclosure an impossible sum that haunted their conversations and dreams alike. There has to be something we haven't considered, Eleanor insisted one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Jack and Noah, papers spread before them like battlefield maps. She'd become a fixture in their home, her initial academic mission expanding to encompass far more than literature. Jack shook his head, the lines in his face deeper than when she'd first met him. We've explored every option. The farm equipment's too old to fetch much at auction. The livestock prices are down. Even if I could work, we couldn't generate enough income before the deadline. What about a loan? Eleanor asked, though they'd discussed this avenue repeatedly. No bank will touch us with our current debt ratio, Jack said, not unkindly. And I won't borrow from friends just to delay the inevitable. Noah sat silent, eyes fixed on the calloused hands that had labored so hard to save what generations of Bennetts had built. Only 17, Eleanor thought, and already facing the kind of defeat that broke grown men. What if, she began, an idea forming that she'd been considering privately for weeks. A knock at the door interrupted her, 3 sharp raps that startled them all. Visitors were rare at Bennett Farm, especially after dark. Noah rose to answer it, returning moments later with Principal Garcia behind him. Eleanor stood quickly, surprise and unease mingling in her chest. Her regular visits to the farm weren't exactly secret, but she hadn't advertised them among her colleagues either. Robert, she acknowledged, unconsciously positioning herself between the principal and the Bennetts. What brings you all the way out here? Garcia removed his hat, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. I noticed a pattern in your records, Eleanor. Noah marked present on days when other teachers noted his absence. He looked past her to Noah. I came to understand the situation myself. The implied accusation hung in the air: professional misconduct, falsifying records, inappropriate involvement with a student's family. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from protective indignation. I can explain, she began, but Jack Bennett cut her off, pushing himself up painfully on his crutches. Mrs. Mitchell has been nothing short of a lifeline for this family, Mr. Garcia. His voice held the quiet dignity that characterized him, even in adversity. If there's fault to be assigned for record-keeping, it lies with me and my son. We've asked too much of her goodwill. Garcia's gaze traveled around the kitchen, taking in the medical bills, the foreclosure notices, the textbooks, the proud but struggling family, before returning to Eleanor. Actually, he said, his tone softening unexpectedly, I came because several faculty members have expressed concern about both Noah's situation and your unusual dedication to helping him. When I investigated further, I began to understand the scope of what's happening here. He placed his hat on the table and pulled out a chair, the gesture of someone preparing for a serious conversation rather than delivering a reprimand. Oak Ridge High has resources that might help if you're willing to accept them, he continued, addressing Jack directly. And our community has faced farm crises before. We've developed some approaches that might be worth considering. For the next hour, they talked about medical assistance programs Jack qualified for but hadn't applied to out of pride, about agricultural grants targeted at family farms, about cooperative arrangements with neighboring properties. Garcia had come prepared, bringing not judgment but information, contacts, possibilities that the isolated Bennetts hadn't known existed. When he rose to leave, the atmosphere in the kitchen had transformed from desperation to cautious hope. Not solutions, not yet, but pathways that hadn't been visible before. At the door, Garcia paused beside Eleanor. "The school board would frown on falsifying attendance records," he said quietly. "But they would applaud a teacher who recognized a student in crisis and mobilized resources to help. Moving forward, I trust you'll find a way to balance your compassion with your professional responsibilities." Eleanor nodded, understanding the gentle course correction and the tacit approval beneath it. "Thank you, Robert." After he departed, she returned to the kitchen to find Noah staring at the notes Garcia had left, his expression a complex mixture of hope and suspicion. "Why would he help us?" he asked. "He doesn't even know us." Eleanor sat beside him, considering her answer carefully. "Because contrary to what hardship teaches us to believe, Noah, most people want to help when they understand what's needed. The trick is letting them see the need in the first place." Jack nodded slowly, his weathered hands gripping his crutches. "Pride's a luxury we can't afford anymore, son. Not if we want to save this farm." That night, driving home under a canopy of winter stars, Eleanor felt something shift within her, a recognition that the boundaries of her life, which had contracted so painfully after Daniel's death, were expanding again. Not in the ways she'd once planned, but in new patterns she couldn't have imagined, centered around a struggling farm and the people who called it home. The weeks before Christmas passed in a blur of activity. Once Principal Garcia opened the door, other help began to flow toward Bennett Farm. The agricultural science teacher organized weekend volunteer groups to tackle major repairs. The school counselor helped Jack navigate medical assistance applications. Noah's classmates, once they understood his situation, created study groups that worked around his farm responsibilities. Eleanor found herself at the center of this growing web of support, coordinating efforts, translating between the rural and academic worlds she now straddled. The empty hours that had once stretched before her were suddenly filled with purpose, her quiet house becoming a planning center for what had evolved into a community mission. "It's not enough," Noah confessed one December afternoon as they sat on the porch, mugs of hot chocolate warming their hands against the winter chill. "All this help. It's incredible, but the numbers still don't add up before the bank's deadline." Eleanor nodded, having reached the same conclusion in her own calculations. The assistants had improved their situation dramatically. Jack was receiving proper medical care, the farm infrastructure was stabilizing, Noah was catching up academically, but the core financial gap remained unbridgeable in the time remaining. "I've been thinking about something," she said carefully, having rehearsed these words many times in private. "I have savings, money Daniel and I put aside for our future, for the family we plan to have." Noah shook his head immediately, understanding her implication. "We can't take your money, Mrs. Mitchell." "Not take," she corrected gently. "Invest. This farm has potential, Noah. With proper equipment, modern techniques, the ones you're always talking about, it could thrive again." He studied her face, searching for pity or obligation, and finding instead genuine conviction. "It's still too much to ask." "You didn't ask." "I'm offering." She turned to face him fully. After Daniel died, that money just sat in accounts, a reminder of dreams that died with him. But lately I've realized something. Those dreams weren't just about having children of our own. They were about creating a legacy, making a difference that outlasts us. She gestured toward the fields, where even in winter dormancy, potential lay waiting. "This farm is a legacy worth preserving, Noah. Not just for your family, but for this community. For the lessons it can teach about perseverance and adaptation." She paused. "And selfishly, for what it's given back to me, a purpose I thought I'd lost forever." Noah was silent for a long moment, his young face solemn with the weight of decisions no teenager should have to make. "Dad would never agree." "Let me talk to your father," Eleanor said. "Not as charity, Noah. As partnership. An investment in the future, yours and mine." That evening, after Noah had gone to bed, Eleanor sat with Jack beside the fireplace, laying out her proposal in clear terms. She watched emotions cross his face: pride, resistance, hope, uncertainty, as she explained her vision for a partnership that would save the farm while preserving the Bennett legacy. "Why?" he asked finally, the single word containing volumes of question. Eleanor looked into the dancing flames, gathering thoughts that had been clarifying slowly over months of involvement with this family. "After Daniel died, I existed rather than lived," she said quietly. "Teaching became mechanical. Home became just empty rooms. The future became something to endure rather than anticipate." She met Jack's eyes. "But here, on this farm with you and Noah, I've remembered what it feels like to be needed, to contribute to something larger than myself, to believe in tomorrow again." Jack studied her, his gaze thoughtful. "And if we fail anyway? If the farm can't be saved, then we'll have failed fighting for something worthwhile." She answered simply, "Better than succeeding at mere survival, which is all I've done these past 3 years." The fire crackled between them, shadows dancing across walls that had witnessed generations of Bennett family decisions. Finally, Jack extended his hand. "Partners then," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not savior and saved, but equals in whatever comes next." As their hands clasped, Eleanor felt something long dormant stirring in her chest, not just purpose, but belonging. The sensation was both familiar and entirely new, like returning to a home she'd never known she had. Christmas Eve transformed Bennett Farm. Lights twinkled from the porch railings, a small tree stood in the corner of the living room, and the aroma of Eleanor's apple pie filled the kitchen. Outside, snow blanketed the fields in pristine white, nature's own fresh start. The bank papers lay signed on the table, documents that had transferred enough of Eleanor's savings to clear the immediate debt, with structured agreements for the partnership moving forward. Not a gift, but a shared investment, preserving both the Bennett's dignity and their legacy. "I still can't believe we did it," Noah said, helping Eleanor arrange cookies on a platter. In the living room, Jack dozed in his chair, pain medication finally allowing him rest without the constant worry that had haunted him for months. "We haven't done it yet," Eleanor reminded him gently. "This is just the beginning. The real work starts after the holidays. Modernizing, implementing your ideas for sustainable practices, building for the future." Noah nodded, but his expression remained one of wonder. "Still, for the first time since Mom died, it feels like we're moving forward instead of just hanging on." The simple observation caught Eleanor off guard with its resonance. Yes, she thought, that's exactly what it feels like. Moving forward again after years of stasis. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Noah went to answer it, returning with wide eyes and a stunned expression. "You might want to come see this," he said. Eleanor followed him to the porch, where she stopped in astonishment. The driveway, previously empty save for Jack's old truck and her Toyota, now held a procession of vehicles. Teachers from school, families from town, neighbors from surrounding farms, all emerging into the snowy evening carrying food, gifts, tools, offerings of every description. Principal Garcia stood at the front, a small Christmas tree in his arms. "We heard there was a farm being saved," he said simply. "Thought you might need a proper celebration." As the impromptu gathering filled the old farmhouse with laughter and conversation, Eleanor found herself watching from the kitchen doorway, overwhelmed by the tangible manifestation of community materializing before her eyes. Noah moved among the visitors, his natural reserve giving way to animated explanations of his plans for the farm. Jack, awakened by the commotion, sat in his chair receiving well wishes with quiet dignity, occasional tears glistening in his eyes. "You've done something remarkable here," a voice said beside her. Eleanor turned to find Sarah Winters, the school counselor, watching the scene with professional appreciation. "I just helped connect the dots," Eleanor demurred. Sarah shook her head. "You gave people permission to care. In a world where we're all taught to mind our own business, that's no small thing." She nodded toward Noah, now showing some classmates his sketches for modern barn designs. "And you've given that young man something beyond saving his farm. You've shown him he doesn't have to face impossible things alone." The observation settled in Eleanor's heart like a seed taking root. Isn't that what she had needed after Daniel's death? Not just casseroles and sympathy cards, but permission to need others, to let help in past the barriers of grief and pride? Later, as the gathering wound down and guests departed into the snowy night, Eleanor found herself on the porch with Jack and Noah, watching taillights disappear down the long driveway. "I never thought I'd see this place full of people again," Jack said quietly. After Marie died, it seemed like the heart went out of everything. Mom would have loved tonight, Noah added, his voice soft with memory and new hope. She always said farms should be full of life, not just animals and crops, but people and laughter too. Eleanor thought of her own house, sitting empty across town, the rooms she'd kept pristine but lifeless, preserving the past at the expense of creating a future. The contrast with this weathered farmhouse, now humming with renewed purpose, couldn't have been starker. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. "That drive gets treacherous in winter. And with all the work ahead of us, it might make sense if I stayed closer." She hesitated. "The old tenant house at the edge of your property, is it still sound?" Jack and Noah exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "It needs work," Jack said slowly. "New roof, updated wiring. But structurally, it's solid as they come." "Been empty too long," Noah added. "A house needs people." The simple statement carried echoes of wisdom beyond his years, an understanding that buildings, like people, required connection to thrive. "We could fix it up," he continued, enthusiasm building in his voice. "I could help with the renovations between farm projects. By spring it could be home," Eleanor finished softly, the word carrying weight and possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Not the home she'd planned with Daniel, but perhaps something equally meaningful. A home defined not by what had been lost, but by what had been found. As they stood together in the gentle snowfall, looking out over fields that would bloom again with spring, Eleanor felt the final pieces of her fragmented heart shifting into new patterns. The cracks would always remain, markers of love and loss that had shaped her, but they no longer defined the boundaries of what she could become. In covering for a student's absence, she had unwittingly opened the door to her own presence, in this community, in this unexpected family, in a future she was only beginning to imagine. Spring arrived at Bennett Farm in a riot of green, nature's affirmation of renewal. The fields that had lain dormant through winter now stirred with new growth, mirroring the transformation that had taken place in the lives intersecting there. Eleanor stood on the porch of the tenant house, her house now, watching the early morning activity across the farmyard. The old barn gleamed with fresh paint, its roof repaired by volunteer hands through the winter months. New fencing marked expanded pastures where healthy cattle grazed. The ancient tractor had been replaced by a more efficient model, part of the strategic investments that were already showing returns. But the most significant changes weren't visible in buildings or equipment. They lived in the straight set of Jack's shoulders as he walked with only a minimal limp, months of proper medical care having worked minor miracles. They showed in Noah's face, the desperate exhaustion replaced by purposeful determination as he balanced school and farm responsibilities with newfound confidence. And they resonated in Eleanor herself, visible perhaps only to those who had known her in the hollow years after Daniel's death. A lightness returned to her step, a sparkle rekindled in her eyes, a capacity for joy she had thought permanently extinguished. "Morning, partner," Jack called, waving as he crossed from the main house toward the barn. The term had begun as a formal designation of their business arrangement, but had evolved into something warmer, a recognition of bonds that transcended financial agreements. Eleanor waved back, gathering the papers she'd been reviewing: college brochures for Noah, scholarship applications, program options that would allow him to pursue agricultural science while remaining connected to the farm. His grades had recovered remarkably under their shared tutelage, opening possibilities that had seemed impossible months ago. Later that afternoon, as spring sunshine warmed the awakening earth, Eleanor walked the perimeter of the farm with Noah, listening as he outlined his vision for summer crops and future innovations. "We're going to make it," he said, not as a question but as quiet certainty. "Not just survive, but actually build something sustainable." Eleanor nodded, hearing in his voice the mature understanding that had been forged through hardship. "Your mother would be proud of who you've become through all this," she said. "And so would your ancestors who built this place." Noah was quiet for a moment, looking out across the fields his family had tended for generations. "I used to think losing the farm would mean losing them too. Mom, the grandparents I remember, the ones I never knew. Like their memory lived in the soil somehow." "And now?" Eleanor prompted gently. "Now I understand it's not just about keeping the land. It's about keeping their values. Perseverance, integrity, caring for something bigger than yourself." He glanced at her. "That's what you helped me see, Mrs." Mitchell. That even if we'd lost the property, those things would have remained. The insight, profound in its simplicity, touched Eleanor deeply. Wasn't that what she'd been learning too? That what remained after loss wasn't emptiness, but the enduring imprint of love, the values shared, the connections that transcended physical presence. They crested the hill that overlooked both farmhouses, the main Bennett home and Eleanor's smaller dwelling, nestled together against the backdrop of fields and forest. From this vantage point, they could see Jack speaking with the veterinarian near the barn, Principal Garcia's car coming up the drive for his now regular weekend visit, and a group of Noah's classmates arriving to help with the spring planting. "Look at that," Eleanor said softly. A year ago, this farm was struggling to survive in isolation. Now it's becoming a center of community again. Noah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's your doing as much as anyone's. You built those bridges." "We built them together," she corrected gently. "When you allowed me to help with your schoolwork, you gave me the first purpose I'd felt since losing Daniel." Every connection that followed grew from that beginning. They stood in companionable silence, watching the activity below. After a moment, Noah spoke again, his voice holding the careful consideration of someone navigating important truth. "You know, in all those literature classes, you taught us about found family, characters who create bonds as meaningful as blood. I think that's what's happened here." He looked at her directly, the boy who had been forced to become a man too soon now speaking with hard-earned wisdom. "You're not trying to replace my mom. I'm not replacing the children you and Daniel hoped for. But somehow we've become family anyway." The simple observation, delivered without drama or excessive sentiment, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Not the painful tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but the fuller, more complex tears of recognition and gratitude. "Yes," she managed, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "That's exactly what's happened." As they made their way back down the hill toward the gathering below, Eleanor thought about the strange, winding path that had led her here, from marking a student falsely present in a classroom to becoming genuinely present in a new life she could never have anticipated. A widowed teacher had covered for her student's absence, unaware he was secretly working to save his farm. But in that simple act of compassion, she had unknowingly opened the door to her own salvation, finding purpose, community, and family where she least expected them. The losses that had shaped them both remained: Eleanor's husband, Noah's mother, the innocence of youth, and the certainty of plans made. But around those absences, new presence had formed. Connections forged in shared struggle, understanding deepened through mutual vulnerability, futures reimagined through collective courage. As they rejoined the others, stepping into the circle of community that had formed around Bennett Farm, Eleanor felt the final piece of her healing heart click into place. Not erasing the past, but incorporating it into a present rich with meaning and a future bright with possibility. A student's absence had led her back to presence, in her teaching, in her community, in her own life. And in that presence, she had found the answer to grief's deepest question: how do we continue after devastating loss? One connection at a time, one act of compassion at a time, one day of choosing presence over absence at a time. Until, almost without noticing, we find ourselves standing in a new season, watching green things grow again where only barren fields had seemed possible.